Hey, friends, this is Tripp, and I hope you watched Brian and Beau's first lecture, Authors of Baptizing America, where they introduced the basic foundations, the historic setup for what we're experiencing as Christian nationalism and the role mainline Protestantism played in it. This one, they're going to look at contemporary situation. It's going to be fun. It's going to be awesome. And you may say to yourself, whoa, Tripp, what about can I raise my hand? You're like, no, this is a recorded lecture. You can't raise your hand, but you could join us on May 30th at 11:30 a.m. ET, Eastern Standard Time. And Brian and Beau are going to be on here. I'm going to take all the questions. I'm going to ask them. We're going to interact live and boom shakalaka. And you can send your question even if you can't join live. And then I'll know to ask it to them. And if you say to yourself, man, whoa, I love thinking and wrestling with theology, politics, and the public square, then you should keep hanging out with us in June. Just go to faithandpolitics.net and you can join Faith and Politics for the rest of us. The homebrewed online class, Diana Butler Bass and Tim Whitaker from the New Evangelicals is helping put this together. It is going to be a zest fun time. And you know why? You know why? We have 6 different scholars dropping lectures. Ooh, you mean like I just am about to experience when I watch Brian and Beau? Yes, Tripp. It's like that, but it keeps going. There's more. You can use them with groups. You can discuss them. You can reflect on it. Well, you know what I mean? That's what's happening. And then they aren't just going to help us have a better understanding of what's happening in the history. We also have multiple perspectives of thick Christian accounts for how you engage in the public square, inspired by your faith, looking towards justice. What does that look like without doing the ugly version that Brian and Beau are about to help us explore? So, hope you enjoy it. Join the live stream May 30th. Join the class, faithandpolitics.net.
Welcome to this session, Baptizing America, How Mainline Protestants Still Perpetuate Christian Nationalism. We hope you watched our earlier session on mainline Protestants and Christian nationalism. I'm Brian Kaylor, a Baptist minister with a PhD in political communication, and I'm president and editor-in-chief of Word and Way.
And I'm Beau Underwood, a Disciples of Christ pastor, and alongside Brian, the co-author of Baptizing America, How Mainline Protestants Help Build Christian Nationalism, that is now out from Chalice Press. As Brian mentioned in our first lecture, we looked at the historical role mainline Protestants have played in advancing Christian nationalism. Now we're going to look at some of those ways it's still happening that you might not be aware of or you might not know how to address. So we hope that through this lecture, you're going to see a little bit more of how Christian nationalism is present in contemporary mainline Protestant witness and how we might address it from within our current churches and communities in a way that actually gets at the root of the problem. To start our conversation, let's go to January 6, 2021. Images like this one were far too familiar to all of us who were captivated by the horror that unfolded that day. And we saw at that rally lots of signs and symbols connecting Christian faith to United States politics. Here we see the American flag and the Christian flag being flown together in a way that clearly symbolizes how they are connected. That to be a good American is to be a good Christian, and in this case, to be supportive of the MAGA movement and President Trump, and to be a Christian are one and the same. The two go together. It's Christian nationalism on full blast right in front of our faces as we watch the Capitol being stormed. But the question is, how did we get to this moment, and what happened after it?
Yeah, it really is important to recognize that January 6th didn't happen out of nowhere. The insurrection was not just a bubbling over. There had been threats of violence, for instance, that people knew that there was a potential. The Washington Post and others the day before were reporting about the threats and warnings about violence during the protests and rallies planned for that day. And so the violence was in many ways anticipated, or at least the potentially anticipated. And same with the Christian nationalism. The Christian symbols that we see that day were not unique to that day. It's something that we had been seeing in conservative evangelical rallies and movements before the election, as well as after the election. I actually went to a couple of Stop the Steal rallies, not with my Trump sign. I was there occupational hazard as a journalist to check it out. And so the Saturday after the election, as I was driving to the Missouri State Capitol just to see what the crowd was going to be like, on the radio, they actually announced and called the race officially for Joe Biden. And I thought, well, this could be interesting, but it did not dampen the spirits or the enthusiasm of the hundreds of people who gathered there that day. And like I said, I went just to see the political side. I thought I'm going to go see what kind of, movement they have there. And of course, there was all of the open carrying of guns and the MAGA flags and the Trump signs and all of that. But then I quickly noticed the Christian symbols as well. There were the Christian flag, like you see there in that image. There was the pine tree flag, an appeal to heaven flag. There were crosses. There were handmade signs with Bible verses or references that God will drain the swamp and other statements like that. And that's when it really caught my attention of there's something religiously happening here, not just politically. And so I was already primed then for that. In fact, on the morning of January 6th, I thought I'll go back down to the state capitol because there were actually gatherings and protests across the country at a number of state capitals on January 6th. Although I'll check out a few minutes of the crowd, take some pictures, and then get home in time to turn on C-SPAN because I'm a nerd, and C-SPAN 2, and watch the vote and see how things go. And so I'm there that morning on January 6th. I'm taking pictures again of the Christian flag and appeal to heaven flag, the Bible verses and the Jesus and God signs. And then when I get home and Beau and I start texting, are you watching what's happening at the Capitol? I'm noticing the same symbols, the same flags, the same scriptures there in the crowd on that day.
Yeah, and I know that out in DC, in the events leading up to January 6th, that there were marches and the blowing of shofars and other religious revival events going on leading up to the day when this peaceful transfer of power was supposed to happen. It really kind of primed those who were in attendance for the idea that this was not just a political moment, not just a democratic moment, but a religious cause that they were participating in, and in some sense was not just a moral concern, but really a transcendent concern, an ultimate concern when it came to the passing of power from one president to another within American democracy. That was January 6, 2021, but we also need to think about what happened at the US Capitol on January 6, 2022.
Yes, 1 year later, when members of Congress decided to gather to commemorate, to lament the events of a year before, primarily only members of the Democratic Party. Unfortunately, a number of members of Congress by this point had decided that they would defend the actions of January 6th as just a normal tourist visit. I've visited the Capitol a number of times and really glad it never looked like that during my visit as a tourist. But as they gathered, there were some remarks and ceremonies in honoring of Capitol police officers in the chambers inside. And then that evening, the Speaker of the House, at that time Nancy Pelosi, gathered an official prayer vigil to, again, mark the occasion to lament what had happened 1 year earlier. But even though Christian nationalism helped fuel the insurrection, even though we just talked about Christian nationalism was part of what led to the violence of that day, the response a year later by those who were opposed to the insurrection was essentially, well, let's just have a friendlier, kindlier, cuddlier version of Christian nationalism. This was a 8-minute ceremony. It didn't last very long. Again, I had on C-SPAN to watch it live, and I was stunned by how quick and short it was. And also that there was no attempt at an interfaith gathering that you might expect at this type of moment. It was an explicitly Christian gathering to mark the occasion of the insurrection a year earlier. It started with a prayer by a Christian minister and someone that we have immense respect for, presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, Michael Curry. But his prayer that day would seem to add to and fuel Christian nationalism as he prayed for this to be one nation under God. He prayed, "We need your help, Lord, now to be the democracy you would have us to be the nation you would have us to be, one nation under God." He prayed that the lawmakers behind him, who are not all Christian, he prayed on their behalf, and that God would bless the nation and bless them to be God's instruments to bring peace and love and healing. And so this was very much a prayer of the nation being Christian. There was a couple of patriotic hymns. Perhaps you recognize them from the Sunday closest to the 4th of July in your own church tradition, but "My Country, 'Tis of Thee" was sung, as was God Bless America, with members of Congress joining the band and singing that as well. And that was it. And I think it's really important to note that if we had a moment today where Speaker Mike Johnson introduced a moment of silence on a prayer vigil that he organized on the steps of the Capitol, and Sean Foyt showed up with his guitar and long flowing curly blonde hair and sang a couple patriotic hymns, and Paula White Cain was there to pray that this would be one nation under God, we would call that Christian nationalism, and rightly so. We would critique that. But Christian nationalism can't just be Christian discourse in public that you politically disagree with. And I think it's also important to recognize that the response to Christian nationalism can't just be a more liberal Christian nationalism. And so we find that this influence is so embedded in our theology and in our practice of public life that even the response to a Christian nationalistic fueled insurrection was, in fact, some Christian nationalism.
Yeah, and Brian, I just want to put a fine point on this because there may be some people watching going, well, this is innocuous, right? What's the harm in Michael Curry praying a prayer and candles being lit and a couple of patriotic hymns being sung? And again, this was an officially sanctioned event by the U.S. Speaker of the House. This was not the Episcopal Church holding an event at the Capitol. This was not a Christian community gathered. This was a government prayer service where only Christian voices were heard. And those who don't claim any faith would have felt like they weren't part of the country being represented at the place where the country's laws are made. So if we think about this not from the standpoint of Christian witness, but this from the standpoint of American democratic life, it's very clear there were a bunch of people being excluded by this. And it's very clear that, the American identity and Christian identities were being fused together in sort of textbook classic Christian nationalism. Now, Michael Curry has done a lot speaking out against Christian nationalism. He's one of the leaders of the incredibly aspiring campaign Christians Against Christian Nationalism. Nancy Pelosi is not a mainline Protestant. She's a devout Catholic, and I'm sure she would be the first to stand up and speak against Christian nationalism. But what we have here is the inadvertent perpetuation of the problem. And it's important that we name it because until we can sort of notice it and where it happens, even in that softer form, we're not going to really be able to address it, because this advanced the Christian nationalism narrative is maybe not to the same intensity as January 6, 2021, but it still reinforced that core belief of the myth that to be a good American is to be a good Christian, and to be a good Christian is to be a good American. That's just what's happening in this picture.
So let's acknowledge our own complicity. So it's not just Bishop Curry and former Speaker Nancy Pelosi. You and I have also been complicit in a softer, cuddlier version of Christian nationalism.
That's true. I'm thinking of a documentary you were a part of for CBS where you were speaking about Christian nationalism in your home church sanctuary with a flag behind you. I'm thinking of the many Scout Sundays in churches I've pastored where the American flag was brought into the sanctuary and it was pledged allegiance to, and it was presented, and then it was placed in that place of honor right behind the pulpit, and then I preached in front of it, right? This soft form of Christian nationalism has been showing up for a long time in a lot of different ways. Let's name two of them here, right? One is this idea of Scout Sunday, the Scouts' motto, for God and for country. Scouting is, at its heart, a Christian nationalistic enterprise. And it might seem like we're reinforcing certain values, but we're also reinforcing, again, that fusion of identities. And when you think about what's going on in church sanctuaries, right? A church sanctuary, as one pastor friend of mine put it to me, is an embassy of heaven. And just like when you walk to the Australian embassy in DC, or you step ground under the Canadian embassy, you don't expect to see the American flag. And in some sense, it operates according to the norms and practices of the host country. It would be strange to have a nationalistic symbol other than the Canadian flag at the Canadian embassy. So why do we have nationalistic symbols of any country, including the United States, in our sanctuaries? If we're worshiping the one who is the God of all the nations, the Lord of Lords, then why are we putting symbols that really reduce God to a nationalistic deity? And yet, in so many sanctuaries, they are there. And those nationalistic practices are reinforced as acts of worship. It's the more and more you think about it, the more problematic it becomes.
So one of the things that I think is important to think about is that if you grew up in a white Christian church in the United States, be it evangelical, Catholic, or mainline Protestant, Christian nationalism is just in the air that we breathe. It's just like the Scout Sundays or the flag in the sanctuary, right? It just seems like the way things are. And that might also include the Sundays that are closest to patriotic holidays like the 4th of July or Memorial Day or Veterans Day, where we would flip to that section of our hymnal and sing the patriotic hymns. And this has become just a part of what it means to be a Christian worshiping in America. When you start to actually take a step back and realize, wait, what's happening here and what do some of the lyrics suggest, it can become more problematic. And we can start to see how mainline Protestants and other traditions have been discipling generations of people to confuse and fuse the American and Christian identities in ways that could help lead to something like a January 6th. For me, this was something that happened after I spent, my observation of this was something that happened after I spent several years as a member of a Mennonite church. And there's not a flag in the sanctuary, and we didn't recognize the patriotic holidays, and that separation has been there quite historically. And then after being in that context for a few years and going back to visit my parents, it happened to be the Sunday closest to 4th of July. And though I grew up in a Baptist church where we sang the patriotic songs, I had been out of that context. That suddenly it hit me. This doesn't feel right. This doesn't sound like we're worshiping God only today. I mean, Jesus taught us you cannot serve two masters. You can only serve one. And so when you start to actually look at some of the hymns, you realize, why are we singing this? Why is this here? And yet it's very prevalent. Take My Country 'Tis of Thee. That's the popular one of the patriotic hymns. It was written by an American Baptist minister and journalist. It was first performed in 1831 at a 4th of July celebration at a church in Boston. And since then, it has been published in more than 1,900 hymnals. But there are others that are also making it in hundreds of hymnals. America the Beautiful is in about 500. Julia Ward Howe's Battle Hymn of the Republic, which was written for Union soldiers at the suggestion of a Unitarian minister, is also in more than 500 hymnals. Then we have God of Our Fathers, which was written by an Episcopal priest and released by the Episcopal Church as the chosen hymn to celebrate the centennial of the U.S. Constitution, has been published in more than 400 hymnals. And the national anthem, which doesn't have a whole lot of religious content in it. It's pretty much just the national anthem. Has appeared also in more than 400 hymnals. Usually they do the first verse and then skip to go back down to the verse that includes God in it in one little reference. And so we can see that these hymnals across the mainline traditions, as well as evangelical traditions, you'll find that in Methodist, Lutheran, Episcopal, Baptist, across the line, you'll find these patriotic hymns there in the hymnals, slowly discipling us to think about merging Christian and American identities.
And Brian, you're pointing out that a lot of the songs being sung in some of the services today that mainline Protestants might roll their eyes at, right? We might see certain evangelical churches with very prominent patriotic worship services around Memorial Day or the 4th of July, one of these holidays, where they're singing these songs that perhaps we wouldn't sing ourselves anymore, but they were written from people within the mainline Protestant tradition. And so even then, it's a gift that mainline Protestantism has given to the Christian nationalism of our moment, a gift that many of us are unaware of, that we have contributed to this problem. So
Yeah,
even
and I
in
would
this,
add, though, that it's not necessarily a past problem. So, I mean, one of the things with COVID, right? And, Beau, you know this as a pastor, all of our services are online now, and you can go peek in on churches. And I do this as a journalist. I peek in on churches across the country all the time. And you can pick a random mainline Protestant church on the Sunday closest to 4th of July, and you will probably hear one of these patriotic hymns being sung more often than not, even still today.
no, you're absolutely right. I have one of my favorite stories in ministry of where I was asked to guest preach at a church on 4th of July, one of my least favorite Sundays to preach. And I said, I'm going to do a gentle critique of nationalism and why it's not Christian. And the pastor was all about it. I had assured her that I wouldn't cause her any problems. And even if I did, she never had to invite me back. We had the whole service planned out. Everything looked great. And then we came to the postlude, and the organist had prepared, unbeknownst to either of us, this patriotic melody. So this whole sermon and the entire message of my sermon was completely undermined by this 5 or 6 minute postlude, When we got out in the parking lot afterwards, the organist, either very aware and not wanting to admit it, or completely unaware, said, "I just felt like the occasion called for that music." And all I could think about was how much we had still missed the mark despite this church's supposedly progressive leanings.
And I think it's important to note that, we're patriotic. We're both very excited and glad to be born in the United States and to have the freedoms to practice our faith. But that we also recognize that there's something different happening in the moment at church.
No, that's absolutely right. There's nowhere else I'd rather live in the United States. At the same time, as a Christian, I want to make sure we're worshiping God and not a nation, and not turning the nation into an idol. Which brings us to the next point we want to make, which is something I think most Americans are unaware of. But in the middle of the 20th century, Congress passed a law requiring the President of the United States, no matter who that president was, no matter what faith that president held, to establish a national day of prayer every year being set aside for the American people. So we have in codified legislation that the ruler of our nation has to set aside a day for prayer.
Yeah, and it continues today. President Biden, we celebrated this just in May. And one thing I think is important to note is the National Day of Prayer, though, has been an evangelical conservative project. James Dobson led it for Shirley Dobson, James Dobson's wife, led it for many years. But in recent years, it's become increasingly attached to the most fringe and dangerous, violent part of Christian nationalism that we see on the right. The Christian nationalism that was heavily involved in fueling the January 6th attack. The National Day of Prayer Task Force is full in on the Seven Mountains Mandate, this charismatic Pentecostal version of Christian nationalism that calls for Christians to take over each realm of public life, each of the seven spheres of culture, the seven mountains, coming from Lance Wallnau and other of these Trump prophets that told us that Donald Trump was going to win. God ordained him in 2016, told us that he was going to win again. And so that helped fuel some of the violence that we saw, because people thought this was God's will. They had been told by these prophets that this was God's will that Trump would win again. And so when it didn't happen and they're being told it's being stolen, well, they need to go and help defend God's will. And so the National Day of Prayer Task Force uses the Seven Mountain language in their prayer materials. They encourage groups to pray over the seven mountains. This is the more violent side of the charismatic conservative Christian nationalism. And yet we also see those who would be opposed to a seven mountain mandate, those who would be opposed to the Christian nationalism that fueled January 6th, like the National Council of Churches, joined in promoting the National Day of Prayer. This is a thing they put on social media from this year, recognizing, celebrating, encouraging people to participate in the National Day of Prayer. And I think that it raises so many questions, not just because of the more violent strand of Christian nationalism that we see attached to the National Day of Prayer, but as you were noting, just the whole idea of why do we have a National Day of Prayer? Why would we have Congress pass a law requiring the president to tell us to pray? I mean, Beau, I don't know about you, but I've never needed the president to tell me to pray.
Well, and Brian, I think that's just exactly the right question, right? What's going on here? And it speaks in the context of Christian nationalism. If the whole point of this ideology is to fuse these two identities to prop up a certain social order, it's the sense that that social order is slipping away, that the power, the influence that used to exist for a certain group of people is now being lost as the country becomes more diverse, more pluralistic. Well, if the churches can't sort of do the work themselves of convincing people to adhere to a certain kind of faith traditions, if we're going to lose the fight on the religious front, well, let's use the power of the government to reinforce the social order and to reinforce our theological beliefs. So in some sense, events like these is not a sign not of strength but of weakness, but it is a sign of power being used in an oppressive way that unfortunately infringes on the rights of lots of other people who don't subscribe to that certain set of Christian beliefs or to Christianity at all. And again, it's a problem in an American democracy when everybody's supposed to be on equal footing, when you have the President of the United States telling the nation it's time to pray.
Tripp.
Now, we have been in our last lecture and in this one fairly critical of the mainline traditions that we love and respect. I'm a mainline Protestant pastor. I really value this church that I'm a part of and the broader witness that our denomination belongs to. So it is worth highlighting that we have not been silent on this. Indeed, to provide just two examples here, my own denomination, the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, passed a resolution at its General Assembly this last year that said, whereas Christian nationalism runs counter to the very heart of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ identity by promoting division and stratification of the human family to the detriment of the unity and equality that our baptisms beget and the Lord's table celebrates, therefore be it resolved that the Christian Church Disciples of Christ denounces Christian nationalism in all its forms as a distortion of the Christian faith, and commits to opposing it wherever it appears for the sake of the gospel and the good of the human family. I like these words. I admire these words. It talks about Christian nationalism in theological language. It names that it's in conflict with our own convictions as a denomination. And it's very strong in saying we denounce this and we're going to oppose it. But what it doesn't do is practice repentance. It doesn't interrogate our own denomination's history in perpetuating this problem. It doesn't look at our past practices or our current modes of worship, as we just talked about, from our hymnody to flags in our sanctuary. It still seems to locate the problem out there, that we've got it figured out, and we're now going to go out in the world and help others figure it out as well. When in reality, we need to start with the log in our own eye before we start talking about the speck in others. So even here, where the mainline Protestant community is taking steps forward, we still haven't done the most important work, the most fundamental work, perhaps the hardest work of looking at our own selves.
Right. And even if it's not a speck in the other, even if it's a flaming January 6th insurrection log in the other, we still need to deal with the log in our own eye as well.
Brian, that's not biblical, though. It says speck in the Bible.
I'm inspired by the words of Jesus, but I'm not a literalist. So another statement that we've seen that is also that does some things really well. It came in April from the General Board of Church and Society of the United Methodist Church. And they released a statement that correctly notes that Christian nationalism is distorting both the Christian faith and the United States Constitution. That is, it's both bad for faith and it's bad for democracy. They noted that it provides cover for white supremacy, racial subjugation. All of this is true. That there are dangers in blending faith and nationalism. It's a threat to religious freedom and the separation of church and state as outlined by the United States Constitution. All of this is excellent, and it's really important to have a significant group inside a mainline Protestant denomination making this type of declaration. But again, there's no acknowledgement of their own complicity as they issued the statement, from the Methodist building there on Capitol Hill, next to the United States Supreme Court and right across the street from the U.S. Capitol. So we think it's really important that mainline Protestants are naming the democratic threat and the heretical nature of Christian nationalism, but not just cathartically of what we see among white evangelicals, but also how it also appears in our own traditions today.
Indeed, what we are wanting to do is to make sure that in our own traditions, we can be as effective as possible in combating this problem. So we have three ideas that I wanted to highlight here, because we know you're probably watching this going, okay, what can we do? This problem feels so big, the threat feels so grave. What can we actually do to address it? And here are three very practical things that you can make happen. First, you can examine and educate within your own sphere of influence, just what we were talking about, right? Let's look at ourselves. Let's look at those places where we have some control. Let's, make sure that we're holding ourselves accountable and not just pointing the finger at others. We spend a lot of energy on social media. We get all worked up being so mad about the Christian nationalism we see in other places, and yet we let it slide when it's happening in our own context. And if we think about the problem of Christian nationalism, as a big giant pie, well, if we can work on our piece of the pie or our piece of the puzzle, we can help solve at least part of the problem. We can make there be less Christian nationalism in the church's witness. So we shouldn't underestimate the value that comes from working in our sphere of influence, even if we can't take care of all that's happening over there. And to do that well, we have to engage in confession and repentance, right? We need to look not just at ourselves and fix what's going forward, but just like other issues of racism and sexism and other problems that we've identified in the past, other places where the church has been participants in injustice, we need to look at the past and repent. We need to name the wrong that was done. That's the only way we're going to be able to honestly move forward, is if we can candidly engage with our past. And this is not just in personal form, this is not just individual confession, but we should also challenge our institutions to speak organizationally, to do that work, right? To have a commission that convenes some sort of conversation that looks at that complicity and names it, as well as denouncing the current expressions that it sees in other places that, again, speaks to its own complicity in what brought us to this moment. And three, we would say that there's a value in the contrast, right? We may not eliminate Christian nationalism completely, but if we can create churches and Christian communities and denominations that are addressing this problem effectively, it creates a contrast with those who might be lighting fireworks off in their sanctuaries, right? There's a different kind of Christian over there that's over here. And I think personally that that's pretty compelling, right? The true Christian community, devoid of the nationalistic tendencies that seem to be taking over so much of the church today, is actually really compelling for a lot of people that are looking for something more authentic, but can't seem to find it in the places where they show up and find the flag in their sanctuary, or the hymn being sung, or the Pledge of Allegiance being offered as part of worship. So there are very practical things you can do in your own place that can make a difference, but you have to be willing to start with yourself and the areas you control versus just trying to hold others accountable when you don't have any authority or influence over them. Brian, anything you want to add to that?
Amen. Let's do the work.
Let's do the work. Thank you all for being a part of these two lectures. We look forward to talking to you more about mainline Protestants and Christian nationalism through our book, Baptizing America, or you can reach out to us. Either of us, you can get a hold of Brian at bkaylor@wordandway.org or me at bunderwood@wordandway.org.